Started. We're going to change the, and welcome to the Joint Committee of Health and Human Services and Public Safety. We're going to change the order this morning a little bit because we're very pleased to have a couple judges with us. So if we're going to do mental health court first so that we can hear from them. And with that, we'd like to invite the Honorable Patty Mitchell, the Honorable Judge Sabat, Vicki Buckland, Dr. Raymond Crowell, and Erica Finn Lopez to please join us at the panel.
And we have a state's attorney.
Oh, is this? Oh, I didn't even realize that. You know, I was going to give him a hard time if I knew that. Well, we're very pleased to have the judges, and we have the state's attorney here. So, anyhow, could you please join us? Did not realize that. You were quiet, and it's not usual. So, anyhow. Thank you for pointing that out. And who's going to lead this off for us, please? Did staff want to start, or did you? There you go. Do you have a late slip, Doctor? Yeah. Yeah, believe me. Linda, did you want to lead us off? Or?
Well, I wanted to just say, so technically this is your budget work session, so your packet does have budget information in it.
We understand.
But I think we're just, I'm so excited that the judges and the state's attorney could come over because the council has, this has been a long time getting the mental health court in place a year ago. And when we met last year, we really didn't have too many months of operations and data. And so you'll have an opportunity to hear more now that it's a long-running court. You'll have opportunity to hear more. There is actually graduation this afternoon, so I think people are very excited about that. So you can hear the observations of the judges, and then Dr. Kroll can take you through some of the data from the perspective of DHHS, which provides the case management from a health and human services perspective, and also the supporting treatment services. Whereas the court, of course, handles the docketing and the administration and case management within the court. So it just is a really good opportunity for you all to hear how it's going.
Thank you. And before we begin, if the chair of HHS had anything to add.
Nope. I look forward to the information this morning. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for your work.
Thank you. Well, if it's okay with you, why don't we start by you giving us the overview that you would like, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the budget.
We'll hear from Dr. Bull first, if that makes more sense. Does it make any difference to us?
No, that's fine.
All right. Well, thank you, and thank you for...
You got to touch them, yeah.
Good morning. My name is Patty Mitchell. I'm the administrative judge for the district court in Montgomery County. I've been a life resident of Montgomery County. I've been a judge there since 1996, when I got dropped off in the carpool line for the court. Judge Sabat and I and Judge Oliver are the three judges in mental health court, and since taking over as the administrative judge a couple of years ago, it really has much more fallen to Judge Sabat and to Judge Oliver, just from a logistic and timing standpoint. But we're happy to be here this morning so that we can present to you some information about our perspective on mental health court. We started in December of 2016. Today, this afternoon, will be our third graduation, and we have a track that's a little bit different than in the circuit court, understandably, because our cases are, of course, misdemeanors and largely quality of life crimes, whereas the circuit court cases are people who have already been convicted and typically are much more serious matters, and so it's a different type of a program. The numbers are quite different, but that makes good sense to us because of the way that we operate our two programs. We have been able to grow the program and the scope of services because of the support of Montgomery County. There are mental health courts in a number of counties in the state, and I don't know that ours is the best. Actually, I do know that ours is the best.
It is.
But
it
to the
is.
extent that we are successful, it is largely due to the resources of the county that are made available to the people who are clients in the mental health court who live in Montgomery County. Our grant through the judiciary for mental health court is capped total for circuit and district courts at 100 people. We presently have 44 active people, and now that we're in graduation modes every 6 months or so, the number is somewhat fluid, and we are in a position to increase the people who are coming in. Our wait list, which was mentioned in your materials, identifies 42 people. It's a little bit misleading because it's not like a wait list to get into a college class. It's not that they're simply waiting for capacity. These are people who have been identified with mental health issues as well as legal problems, but many of them are not yet competent. So while they're on the wait list, they're not able legally to even evaluate whether or not they want to participate in mental health court because they're not competent to make that decision. They can't accept or reject being in mental health court because they're not yet in a position to communicate even with their attorneys. So we also have a few people on the wait list who are in warrant status, meaning that we don't exactly know where they are right now. We know they'd be eligible and perhaps welcome to participate, but they haven't shown up for court. So when we say wait list, it's not just that people are waiting in line for someone to graduate. In fiscal year 2019, we've had 33 new admissions and 17 graduates, including the ones that we have today. Out of the 63 participants since we started in total, there have been, for those folks, just those 63 people, 390 arrests in their adult lives. And so while we're a misdemeanor court, you can see that the problems that are affiliated and associated with mental illness and with homelessness and with lack of resources create criminal problems for the community as well as for the families, for merchants and everyone, from the people who are sleeping in 7-Eleven to the people that are taunting you outside of Night Spots in Silver Spring. These are the things that we try to work with. One of the things that Ms. McMillan mentioned in her memo was the existence of any barriers. We do see some barriers, and Judge Sabet, I'm sure, will be able to expand on this as well, but one of the main barriers that we've talked about a lot is housing. And different kinds of housing, because obviously we're dealing with people of limited means and limited resources. So the housing piece of things is complicated for people in the county, even if they have resources and means and have their wits about them. There is a dearth in the county of permanent supportive housing that gives some measure of service or support to people. There is less than that of residential or therapy-based housing, like residential rehab programs, which there's a high demand, and there may be some beds in the county, but for reasons that we don't control or can't explain, I guess we can understand hospitals have priorities on placing people from hospitals into these residential programs as opposed to us who have people in the community or people in jail. So the lack of that and the lack of low barrier housing, shelters, not just shelters like Goody Drive, but shelters that can offer a little bit of support, community management, medication management, even if not therapy, is also dissipating. Things like Safe Haven. And those are not things that shelters and crisis center staffing are expected or should have to do. So we do see the housing piece as an issue, and it's a conundrum because obviously all type of housing in this area is tremendously expensive, and that type of housing is commanding of huge resources. There's a little bit of complication from the insurance piece that was also mentioned in Ms. McMillan's memo. Clearly, the benefits that people get through the county, through Medicare, Medicaid, public benefits, give us a lot more flexibility in the services that we can provide. Not that private insurance isn't good. We would be happy for everyone to have insurance, but I think, as we all know, private insurance is very finicky when it comes to mental health treatment, the scope of services, the nature, the co-pays, and things like that. So, that's to a lesser extent an issue. And transportation. We provide transportation, we provide chits, we provide tokens, we provide Uber, and we have different ways of doing that. But we're a big county, and geographically, sometimes people just don't have access to real good transportation. I don't know that that's anything that any of us have a solution for immediately. I think if we did, we would have done it by now. We feel lucky with mental health court to have been adopted by Montgomery's Miracles. And for those of you who haven't had any experience with Montgomery's Miracles, it is a 501c3 corporation that was originally developed to support drug court participants. Drug court predates mental health court, and the 501c3 allows us to tap into charitable resources that are donated, which allows us to have funds for things that public monies can't pay for, such as gift cards, incentives, rewards, and clothing, shoes, sometimes helping people pay for tuition, for dental bills, community college classes, all things that we recognize folks need, but things that our judiciary grant would not allow us to pay for. So Montgomery's Miracles, which is a very nicely endowed organization now, underwrites those things for us, for mental health court and the circuit court, and for the drug court, and we're tremendously grateful for that, because it's really made a difference in the way that we can engage our people in court. We currently have a single track in mental health court, which is the voluntary track. And I distinguish that because we're planning a second track called the competency track. And that's the type of expansion that we wanted to bring to your attention today. It is not necessarily that we're going to have another mental health court day, and I can explain how that works with our docketing and how complicated it can be for me to dedicate one judge every day, every week, to 25 or 50 cases, whereas all the other judges are doing 100 or 150 cases every day. So you can see where the logjam could flow. But the competency track is a way that we feel we can expand the scope of what mental health court offers by tracking people who are not yet competent, not yet in mental health court, but obviously, by nature of their arrest, by their bond review, by observations of other people, could benefit from services that the county has to offer. So by trying to consolidate people who are pending competency restoration, we hope to engage those individuals early in the process so that we can perhaps steer them into mental health court or steer them into kind of a soft landing for other services that may be available, even if they're not. And I think that I will defer to Dr. Kroll, but I think the earlier that we can engage people and demonstrate some benefit from treatment, the less likely we are to have recidivism. So that's kind of my opening observations that I wanted to share. I don't know, Judge Sabet was nice enough not to interrupt and correct me, but I'm happy for her to do that.
No, it was great.
Thank you. And go ahead, please.
What she said. But, yeah, let me turn my microphone on. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Marina Sabet, and I am the coordinating judge for the mental health court. I was fortunate enough to be appointed in January of 2017, so somewhat coincident with the beginning of mental health court. Very briefly, my background prior to that, I was an administrative law judge for approximately 14 years. One of my specialties was mental health. So involuntary commitments, NCRs, we did many other things as well, but we had subject matter specialties, and that was mine. So that's probably kind of why I'm here. Prior to that, I was a partner in a law firm for a number of years as well. So I have to echo everything that Judge Mitchell has said, but I will not restate certainly everything she said. But just to emphasize in terms of the barriers that we've seen, I can truthfully say that from a day-to-day perspective, housing is a huge issue with us. Obviously, we need to ensure, and part of our criteria mandate that the person be in court-approved housing. And the problems that we're running into is not so much with the permanent supportive, although that, again, is, as Judge Mitchell said, there is a dearth of that, and that is difficult to come by. But we've seen that some of our people cannot be successful in that type of housing because it's not the type of therapy-based wrap your arms around that is necessary to keep our people engaged and keep our people safe. And because there is this high demand for RRPs, and because the hospitals do have priority, we do not, and it makes it very difficult. To exacerbate that problem, we have the low barrier housing, we'll call it, places like Safe Haven, no longer available to us. And that's of deep concern because oftentimes while we had people waiting for an RRP, that's where they would be. The alternative really is being held in jail. And that is not what we want to be doing. That is, although an excellent environment in terms of how jails go, I think that they do a great job in Montgomery County, it's not the therapeutic setting that we want for our people. And the shelters and the crisis center, although they certainly do their part, of course the shelters are mainly closed now, but the crisis center really isn't equipped to handle the type of people that we have in our population. So that is a big concern of ours. As Judge Mitchell said as well, one of the things that we're moving toward is this competency track. We have always tracked the competency people. We've tracked them in our wait list, which is why, as Judge Mitchell said, and I'm sure as Dr. Carl will say as well, is a little misleading because it's not as if these people are clamoring to get in. They can't because they're not competent. They're not allowed to voluntarily sign in because they're not legally able to do so at that juncture. But our hope is that by intercepting essentially all of their cases when they are assessed by Dr. Julie Smith preliminarily and they come back after the 7 days, by having that docket and having a judge assess them then, as well as our therapists, in this separate docket that likely will be on an afternoon, but it's in the works how we're going to staff it and how we're going to do it, we'll be able to make a determination of whether those persons are truly appropriate for mental health court or whether they just need some guidance as they move through and are restored to competency, which can, by the way, be in any hospital now across the state, which is also problematic, which is also why it was very difficult for us to track them previously, because they may be found not competent. And it used to be we would think they all go to Springfield or maybe Spring Grove. Now they go to Eastern Shore, they're going to Hagerstown, they're also going to Adventist, which of course is in our backyard, but it was problematic and remains so. So our hope is that we'll be able to wrap our arms around this population and make it easier for us to intercept, to bring people into the now what we call the voluntary track, where people actually sign in mental health court, as well as Judge Mitchell very aptly stated, create the ability of a soft landing back into the community. I will tell you that in terms of numbers, and I'm sure that you will speak to this more, is that if we were to get, and I'm hopeful that we will, it's been tricky ramping up because of the timing and everything of getting all the people, the 75, engaged in the voluntary track. It would, I would imagine, be difficult for our therapists to also engage those on the voluntary track in any meaningful way. Because they would have their hands full at that point. But our hope, as I said, is to wrap our arms around the greatest mental health population possible, and that's what we're aiming to do.
Well, thank you. And we're going to hear from the rest of the panel, but I just wanted to say very, very clearly that it truly is, both of you and the state's attorney and the Health and Human Services and everybody else that's associated with this, it really is the dream come true. When we first started talking about this a couple of years ago now, we realized that we had the chance to change people's lives for the better, and that we could divert them from an incarcerated setting and that they and their families could end up in a much better place. And that's exactly, I mean, I've been to, I guess, both graduations. I will stop by today if we're in budget, so we're going to have to run through. But it is truly impressive, the people that you have helped, and the way that you've worked with them, from the state's attorney and from HHS, but especially the judges. I mean, that you sit, you know every person by their first name, you work with them on a weekly basis or whatever, and you really have gotten people from a place where they really were in a very dark place to a place which is so much more of an enlightened place for them and their families. And I know it's been very tough on the families. Well, I do have two very quick questions, and I ask my colleagues if they have any, but for the court-approved housing, do you ever allow someone, if it's possible, to live in their family home while they're doing this?
Absolutely. I mean, that is if it is an option.
We just want to know where they are, and we want to make sure where they're not. That's more than it is. It's not that we have approved housing. We want to know, where do you want to live? Because we don't want you in a crack house. We don't want you in a house where everyone else is using drugs. It's more that. We're not finding the housing, but we're working with you to make sure that it's going to be safe.
And then the other thing, is the term wait list, is that an industry term? Can we change the term and call it something else?
Sure.
All right, all right. You brought a wordsmith with you, is that?
So, good morning. I'm Dr. Raymond Kroll. I'm the Chief of Behavioral Health and Crisis Services. Good to see you all again for another round of budget and discussions about our programs. I want to do a couple of things. One is just to set a broader context for this, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. We do a lot of work with forensics or justice-involved residents in Montgomery County. We've developed what we call a sequential intercept model that tries with all our might to try to identify folks who have mental health or substance abuse issues or issues that don't necessarily require incarceration, and divert them or deflect them from jail, to keep them out of jail, to keep them out of the courts, to keep them from being charged and prosecuted, and to keep them from a spiral of jail to community to jail to community. So along the way, we do things like, you'll hear about crisis intervention teams or STEER, our outreach efforts. You'll hear about our efforts, clinical assessment and triage, CATS and JAZZ, our jail addiction services program in the jail. Mental health court, drug court are part of that sequential intercept model. And you'll hear about our reentry programs along the way that collaborate and partner with everybody in the justice system, from the courts to the police to Department of Corrections to the state's attorneys and the public defenders, to try to say, this is someone who, with some help and with some support, doesn't need to be in jail, doesn't need to be charged and convicted of a crime. And if they have been, it's an opportunity for them to clear their records and get back on a straight and narrow path, as you'll hear in the drug court. That's the broader context of this. I think to your data question in particular, as we talk about mental health court, there's a sheet I think that you all have that is our effort late this week to recraft that language to make it a little clearer. The table that you were sent initially, that we sent over initially, was a mixture of both district court and circuit court, and it jumbled the numbers in some ways. And we changed the language to your question. Wait,
That's the one we just
Yes.
received.
yes,
the
wait
update.
list. Wait list is a serious misnomer.
Okay.
When we think of wait list, we think of people who are accepted, ready to go into the program, and are just waiting. And that's not what this is. So we recrafted it as referrals to the program. And a referral could come from the state's attorney's office, from the public defender, from a parent who's got a child that they're interested in maybe having in the court, to CATS, our CATS programs, and any number of other places that might be. So it says this is a person that might be eligible for mental health court. And there's a whole process that has to happen. One is their competency issues. The other one is a screening by the courts to make sure that they are potentially eligible and they meet some criteria. And the other one, of course, is that the state's attorney's office has to sign off on it, because looking at the criminal history and the nature of the charges that the person is facing, to say, yeah, this is somebody that's okay for us to go to court with in mental health court. So that's what referral is. Our waiting list, if you will, is listed as number assessed and pending court admission. And those are the folks that have been referred, that we have looked at and gone through a process of assessment and come up with a strategy for how we would work with them. And indeed, when you see numbers assessed, those are folks that we regard as being involved in the mental health court and being considered for active participation in mental health court. The ones that are pending court admission, we are already actively working with, and we're waiting now for a docket date for them to have their first official day where they become an official part of drug court. So that's the sequence with which we go through to get folks in. And that's the clarification of the data. We broke it out for district and circuit court so you could see it a little bit more clearly for each court. Of course, the circuit court are folks who have been convicted of an offense and are being given an opportunity to work through that process by being a part of the mental health court. And that more closely, I think, resembles our drug court model as well, since that operates on the circuit court side. I want to underscore the barriers. I think the barriers that folks have talked about are real. We have done a lot of work with our residential crisis service to try to deal with folks who are coming into the courts who need some place to stay in the short run. The residential rehab programs are driven and guided by the state, and the number of beds available are controlled by the state, and there has not been an increase in over a decade. I think the housing is always going to be an issue for us. Any other things you've heard today, so I won't belabor them. On the upside of this, I think what has really been nice about this, Councilmember Katz, you talked about us talking about this for the last several years. I've been talking about this since I got here. In my first year, and I'll be 10 years this July. And since I first got here, there was a wish and a desire to have a mental health court. A lot of pieces had to come together, and several years ago, they did come together finally. We had judges that were interested and willing. We had state's attorney's office that helped to drive this process, and members from the council and members from around the county that helped to make that a reality. And I think none of it would have been possible without that teamwork. And in part, and very much in part, due to the person who's sitting to my right, John McCarthy, our state's attorney. And I think that is, that collaboration and partnership is what has made this possible. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and let you ask questions.
With that introduction, Mr. McCarthy, please.
Thank you, Ray. Can I say, first of all, I want to say something about the district court judges. First of all, I listened very carefully to Judge Sabet and Judge Mitchell's comments, and quite candidly, and Ray really just spoke to this, this has been a collaboration. I will tell you, I've been inspired by the work that's been done by the district court judges. Quite candidly, listening closely to Judge Sabet and her background, she's actually a perfect person to have in this particular role. So I want to thank them for, and this is really, we are independent agencies, but I will tell you, this is a collaborative effort. And I don't think there's probably anybody around here that knows this better than you, Mr. Katz. When we had and put this together, and I think this is what Ray was talking about, I hired a former member of the county council.
Yes,
and my assigned, when I hired Phil Andrews, my request of him is, Phil, we need a mental health court. That's going to be your primary job to get us a mental health court here. We got some wonderful allies, including John Morrissey, who's the head of the district court for all of the state of Maryland. And John Morrissey is a huge proponent of mental health courts. And he made sure and kind of drove from an administrative level from Annapolis that we got this started here in Montgomery County. Now, I have two wonderful people in my office. Kathy Knight, who's the head of my district court, who's here, and Karen Mooney. Kathy really is our primary person who oversees the day-to-day operation of the presence of my office in the mental health courts. Karen does the circuit court component, which is the smaller component, and Karen also oversees the drug court, which, again, we have, and this is something else we should be proud of, we have more diversionary alternatives to incarceration programs in Montgomery County than any jurisdiction in the state of Maryland, by far. And that's been our tradition. And the investment, and I know that when the investment was made, the county council was 100% in favor of it. Every council member, our current county executive, everybody was on board. Our former county executive, everyone knew that the need was there. And I will tell you, we're talking about dollars. Besides the fact that it's humane and the right way to deal with this particular critical issue in criminal justice, Kathy mentioned to me, Kathy Knight, who's behind me, mentioned that we're going to have 28 graduates from the mental health court. One instance of recidivism from anybody has graduated. So one of the things I'm here to say, I love that number, because I'm a sworn responsibility is to maintain public safety. And quite candidly, besides it being the right way of doing it, I also think the people who benefited from this program also are not coming back to us. I know, Mr. Katz, we heard a story during the work sessions when we were putting this together about an individual guy who'd been in and out of the jail 28 times in an individual year, let alone having 28 individuals now reintegrated back into the community with one act of recidivism. I think that's a great thing. I don't know what the proper amount of money is that's needed, but quite candidly, because local governments in particular, since we deinstitutionalized the mentally ill, have never really stepped up to the plate. This is not a criticism of Montgomery County. It's just a functional reality of where we are in America. 1 out of 2 contacts for every police officer in America on the other side of the equation, the person has a mental health issue in play. Go to any jail in America, 1 out of 3 people in any American jail probably should be in a different institution, not in a jail. We get that here in Montgomery County. 6,000 times special units of the police department intercede in crisis situations just last year, where they're going out to emergency crisis intervention. We're scratching the surface. We're starting, and I want to salute, we've actually doubled the capacity of this since we started. If anybody missed that, we started at 50, we went to 100. Look, we will never have a problem filling the spaces available to help the mentally ill in this community and put them in the more appropriate place. But I'm here mainly, if you have specific questions, I'm going to defer to Kathy Knight or to Karen Muni. I want to thank you for the support. It's the right way to govern. It's the right way we should go. And quite candidly, we probably need more of the same, because we are not serving all those that deserve these same level of services. But I want to congratulate everybody at this table. It really is a collaboration. And that includes the public, they're not here, but the Public Defender's Office is part of that. So I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We're all working together on this.
Thank you. Well said. Any questions? If not, we're going to actually go through the actual pack. Do you have something?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for your leadership and yours, Mr. Chairman, on moving this ahead so effectively just in the last couple of years. Just a couple quick questions. Could you clarify what happens with the waitlisted participants? Is it they're definitely not eligible for any kind of prosecution while they're waiting for admission?
While they're waiting for admission, first of all, if they're competent, nothing is happening, because we're hoping that they get restored and they wouldn't be capable of making any legal decisions with their attorneys, and so they're just on hold, usually in treatment, not at the jail. Once they are competent, if they're still on the wait list or they've been referred and not accepted yet, then their cases are pending for prosecution. But it's not a race. If they're considered appropriate for mental health court, then their cases are not going to be prosecuted, and then that gets pulled out from under them. We will find a place for them in mental health court if they are appropriate on the wait list and want to be in, if all things come together. So it's not a contest of does your trial date come first or your mental health court acceptance, because that doesn't help us. So when we have people who even show up on the day of court and think, maybe this is the right thing, then we'll continue their case for 45 or 60 days, which is longer than I would normally do, because we try to get people in and out fast of criminal court. But we will continue at 45 to 60 days so that the people in Ray's office can do the necessary screening, collect the necessary medical records and history, get the HIPAA releases, and make a measured and appropriate decision about whether or not that individual would be in. It's ultimately up to the individual on the wait list if they want to stay on the wait list or if they want to make some other resolution of their case.
Great. I was hoping that was your answer. I wanted to clarify it.
Oh, good.
Which brings us back to the budget hearings we're in. Judge, I loved everything you said about the system wanting to wrap its arms around the greatest population possible. And so while you look at the competency track, which I'm all for that spirit in addressing that population, something I've asked Ray and John about before is the level of interest in also expanding to our juvenile population. We're in budget hearings every night these days. And last night, we heard over and over and over from parents and from school psychologists and people who want to be school psychologists about how widespread mental illness is among our juveniles, how much of it goes undiagnosed. I know there's plenty of evidence that shows the more often our young people come into contact with our police and into the justice system, the more likely they are to come into contact with it as adults as well. And I know these courts have been very, personal experience with it you guys know about, but I know these courts have been very successful in other jurisdictions, both because while you need the involvement of family or guardians, the potential for young people to change their habits they're more successful at it than us older folks in many cases, and there's more lifetime ahead of them where you get more benefits of good behavior and more savings to the taxpayer. So I'm very glad this court has stood up and we're talking about expanding it. And I wanted to ask, not that there's a trade-off, because I'm in favor of both, but what the level of interest is in expanding it to juveniles as well, as so many other jurisdictions have done.
Let me just say one thing, and
No, please, go ahead.
I agree with everything that you're saying. I think that's a great point. And I can speak anecdotally that I believe the judiciary's Office of Problem-Solving Courts, which underwrites our grants in Annapolis, would be fully in support of that type of an expansion. It's not within our court's jurisdiction. It would have to be in the circuit court since they have jurisdiction over juveniles. We only see juveniles for non-incarcerable traffic tickets. That's the limit of our jurisdiction. So anyone who's under 18 and in juvenile SINA or delinquency hearings is going to be in the circuit court.
But the circuit court, the court themselves would have to approve the change, I'm assuming, but the county actually funds the circuit court, so we would have to be able to, we would have to come up with the money, which I'm in favor of but we would have to get approval before we could even spend the money, I
I
guess.
think it's hard for me to say how that works since I'm part of the state-funded court system. Bob Greenberg would know the answers better than I, since juvenile court we were divested of juvenile court in 1998. I think. Up until that time, we had it, but now it's been with the circuit court properly since that time.
One of the great surprises I had when I started working with the county is that the circuit court is funded by Montgomery County. And I said that whoever from the state made that negotiated deal was a great negotiator. I mean, you know.
It's an interesting process. Just as an aside, every circuit court is locally funded throughout the state, and that's been an issue. Certainly, I think the judiciary would like everyone to be funded by the state, but I think the circuit courts much prefer the flexibility and the resources of being funded locally. It's a hybrid. There are state court employees that work in our circuit court, but much of it is funded by the county, and I think that Judge Greenberg would say that that's been to their benefit.
Did you wanted to add anything on that?
No, the only thing I would say, and I would actually defer to Doctor on this, is that I would also assume that in terms of staffing, that even from a judge perspective and certainly from a therapist perspective, it would look very different than what our court looks like now. So I don't want to say too much because we've not really explored it, and again, it's outside of our jurisdiction, unfortunately. But what we could do, I couldn't imagine personally seeing the two courts meld because they are so different, and frankly, I don't know that we would want to meld those populations because there's something to be said for keeping them separate for any number of reasons, some of which are obvious, some of which are not.
If I could just add, assuming a child is accused of having committed what would be as an adult a crime, or a delinquent act for a child, we only see in the state's attorney's office referred, about 45% of those children are actually referred. 55% of all children accused or alleged to have committed a delinquent act are held at intake. And the Department of Juvenile Services handles that particular matter. So more than 50% of our cases never get to the court, never get to the state's attorney's office. So and look, I am not here in opposition to offering services to those children. I just think it is a more complex issue that would involve not just the courts, but the Department of Juvenile Services, because the majority of children who come into the system never get to the courts, never get to the state's attorney's office, and I would say probably many of them have the mental health issues that we are suggesting we want to give them assistance with. We have other players that would have to be brought into that conversation.
And I would just add that to underscore what John just said, that we do work with Department of Juvenile Services for folks who have minor offenses, possession, and maybe misdemeanors due to mental health issues, and do work to screen them. We have a program called SASCA that does screening and referrals for treatment for folks who are juveniles to keep them. The Juvenile Services holds them at intake while we're working with them, and if the conclusion is successful, then there's no further charge. They're not referred to the juvenile court. Mm-hmm. Where that doesn't work, they may well be referred to juvenile court, where the court may make a decision to not prosecute or to not take the further charges any farther, or may drop them. And in some cases, that's fine. It's sufficient. In other cases, it recycles. Is it? If we were going to do something different with that and do something more formal with the courts around that, I think it would be Juvenile Services, the courts, SAS, outside HHS, you all at the table to try to figure out what that model should look like.
Yeah, I totally agree. It has to be, what works in other jurisdictions, my understanding is multi-agency coordinating, including and also multiple levels of government with somebody from the feds involved too to help with Medicaid, et cetera. So
I would say that the family engagement is essential. And
Absolutely.
The difference, one of the differences is that we're dealing with, on the adult side, we may be dealing with housing, we may be dealing with many more complex issues. The school system, for example, domestic issues at home and income supports for families. It gets very, very complex when we start involving children, when we start looking at children.
Right, but I think that complexity is not a reason not to move forward.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Albornoz, please. Are you first? Okay, whoever. Yeah.
A very deferential committee, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for this great summary of the work that you do. And Mr. McCarthy, thank you for sharing the information about the recidivism rate, which is one of the questions. And just to drill down on that, one individual or? One person. That's phenomenal.
I absolutely agree with that. You know, our recidivism rates, as compared to normal recidivism rates that oftentimes run 50%. With children, by the way, the recidivism, one of the sad things with younger kids is the younger you come into the system, the age of onset, the earlier you come into the criminal justice system, the higher it becomes a predictor of your being a recidivist. It's almost 1-to-1. If you come in as early as 12 or 13 or 14, you're coming back. And with adults, it's about the same too. So this is a small fraction of the normal recidivism rate. This is money well spent.
That's exactly it. And going back to a theme that had been touched upon multiple times, particularly by the judges, housing. Drilling down on that, I think you had talked about court-appointed housing or court-appropriate housing. A court-approved, thank you. I saw the A, I didn't see what I wrote after that. Elaborate a little bit more on what that approval means.
We want to know that the people who are participating are in an atmosphere that's going to support their success. Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that the home or the place where they're living is safe, is not a drug house, is not outside of Montgomery County, is not a place that makes it impossible for them to get to services and to get to court. And we've had people who, sometimes this is managed housing, sometimes it's a room in a house. It's not, we don't have strict parameters that are written. We just want to make sure that you're in a place that supports the commitment that you've made to the court system. We had one young man who was desirous of living, not going home for legitimate reasons, wanted to live in a house, a room that a friend's mom had, and we thought that sounded great. In the beginning, we approved it, and it turned out that, mom was high all the time, and don't know how many people were renting that same room in that same house, and it became a nightmare. So it's not that we're trying to be dictatorial to people. We want them to make their own decisions. We want them to make good decisions. We want them to be responsible for themselves, but we also want to make sure that we can guide them.
So it's one of those legal standards that you know it when you see it.
Yeah, it's not even a legal standard, it's a contractual standard. It's in their written agreement. When they choose to participate, they agree that they'll show up for court, they'll go to therapy, they'll take medication, they'll contact their worker once a week, they'll live in court-approved housing, they won't get arrested again, they won't use drugs or alcohol, and they'll submit to tests as needed for things like that. So it's more like a condition of probation, kind of.
Another term you had used was safe havens. Yeah.
Go.
Punch the button on that one. Yeah, Safe Haven was the name of a low-barrier housing opportunity for our people that's closing at the end of this month. And what I meant by that was, I'm sure it was a safe haven, it was appropriately named. It really was sort of an intermediary housing experience for those who were awaiting a more managed residential type placement where they could have medication administration and that type of thing. That is going to be gone. And that makes it very problematic for us because there are some people who simply cannot live out in the community and cannot live in the crisis center without that kind of medication management. So that's what we're concerned about. And when we talk about court-approved housing, we had, I was going to say, one person who would have preferred to live on the streets, but we knew from our experiences and the criminogenic factors and everything that simply wasn't going to work in terms of managing his case. We've had another gentleman whose mother developed dementia and wasn't able to provide him his medication, and he decompensated. So it's those types of things. So when we say court approved, it allows the court to say, you contracted for this. We're now able to dictate that you may not live in a place that's dangerous. Otherwise, we wouldn't really have that authority. So that's all that means.
And at this point, I'd like to bring Ms. Buckland into the conversation, and as it relates to housing and Safe Haven or any other facilities, what is the coordination with DHHS, if any?
So Safe Haven in particular was a program that the Interagency Commission on Homelessness, in making their funding and appropriation recommendations for the joint application that gets forwarded to HUD, chose to put that as a Tier 2 program, and HUD chose to not fund it. So that's what happened to the Safe Haven program. That was the loss of HUD funding. When we became aware of that decision on the part of HUD, we've been in close contact with MCCH and coordinating on making sure that those folks have placements and to find alternate housing for those individuals. Certainly, as you guys have heard when we did the briefing with Amanda and others, there's obviously a lot of movement and a lot of effort on the housing front. And one of the notes that I made actually as we were here was that that discussion and coordination with the court about what's the movement, how does that work, what are the methods that we use around housing, that may be a loop that we need to close so that you guys then are also kind of know what to expect and what's possible and how that system is functioning at this point. So that was one of the things that I had written for myself listening to that. But that's what happened with that particular program.
Well, I appreciate that background as the council's lead on homelessness in vulnerable communities, and as a board member or commissioner on the interagency, I will certainly work with you and help close that loop and see what we can do.
I just
Thank you, Linda. Go,
I
please.
just wanted to add on safe havens. Safe havens is actually considered to be a type of shelter. And so as we've moved more people in the homeless system into permanent supportive housing, there actually was much less demand for safe haven from the continuum of care on the homeless side. And so the difference between safe haven and, for example, like the Goody shelter, safe haven is for people who have mental illness, mental health issues, but it is considered a shelter, but people were sort of getting stuck there because it didn't have a time limit. The way the federal program was set up, it didn't have a time limit, and so people could stay for a long time. But as we moved those people into permanent supportive housing, which is really where they should be, we want them in permanent housing, then the demand for safe havens became less. Now, how we want to talk about what kind of supportive housing we need for the folks who are in the mental health court is an important conversation, but it may be different from the actual structure of what a safe haven shelter was supposed to be. The HUD is continuing to fund veterans safe haven, and we do have a veterans safe haven that the coalition runs, and that stays in place. So the one that HUD did not fund is because of their emphasis away from shelter and for permanent housing, and also it is not the veterans safe haven. So I just did want to say those two things.
Again, I look forward to working with you on this. Thank you.
Councilman Roberts, please.
Well, first of all, I'm very impressed with the level of collaboration that I've heard today. I know these issues are complex and systematic, and so I want to thank all of you for your dedication to really creating an infrastructure and a safety net that is very important for families and very helpful to address these issues. And this issue hits very close to home for me. An extended member of my family exhibited signs of bipolar disorder in his late teens, to Councilmember Hucker's point, but was not officially diagnosed until his early 20s when he started exhibiting violent behavior, self-medicated, and my uncle and aunt did everything they could and went through a spiral of hell trying to do everything they could to support my cousin and tried to identify beds within our state system. Were not able to because my cousin was over the age of 18 and certainly, obviously, had his own rights, but he was right on that fence of not having done anything dramatic enough yet to trigger an additional layer of support through various systems, but everybody knew that that would happen at some point. And so had this infrastructure been in place 12 years ago when this began impacting my family, I suspect my cousin wouldn't be where he is now. And so I want to just express my complete and total support for this effort, but did have a couple of questions regarding those systematic issues because, Dr. Crowell, you alluded to the state continuing to not have expanded its capacity further upstream so that we prevent cases from getting through the legal system to begin with. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and let us know, are there any efforts that you're aware of at the state level to increase that capacity? And is this something or an area that maybe working with our delegation and the governor's office we can create more capacity for?
I don't know that we have enough time. I will try to stay off of my normal soapbox about this and say that one of the things that struck me this morning as Judge Sabet was talking is that when we solve one problem, we kind of inadvertently create another one. We had been having a backup in the jail of folks who needed transport to psychiatric facilities, and I think the number would average 20 or 30 with very extended days. We spent I guess a year and a half going up and back and forth with the state, and they finally, with the support of the courts from a number of jurisdictions, finally said, you'll do this or we'll hold you in contempt because you're violating the law. And with that, they began to open more beds and create more step-down units across the state. And one of the things they did was they went from a regionalization of state hospitals, so our folks, instead of going to Spring Grove, where there might not be any beds, could go to any available bed in the state. So it dropped the numbers of folks who are sitting in jail waiting on a state bed to 2 or 3 at any given time, and they shortened the length of stay. So we worked with them, they solved the problem. The downside of that is now, of course, because they're spread around so much, it makes them harder to track and work with on the backside, and our teams have to canvass the state to try to outreach and engage them. So that I think is one of the things. With regard to residential rehabilitation, the state has not expanded beds anywhere in the state that I'm aware of in a very long time. We have sent a couple of requests in the time that I've been here to expand the beds because we have a kind of a constant waiting list. And as Judge Sabet noted, the state's prioritized folks who are in the hospital for coming out. The state has looked to expand residential crisis beds for short-term stays for folks as a way of diverting them from jail, as a way of diverting them from inpatient hospital stays. They are also interested, but have not done a lot with this, in creating supported housing beds that are the step down for residential rehabilitation beds, because their thinking is that RRP should be a transitional housing. The reality is that there are folks who are in RRP who need that level of intensity and are likely to need it for a very long time. And so the flow out of residential rehab is always going to be a little slow. So the front door and the back door are the things they're working on. I don't know of anything in the moment that they're working on to try to expand that. There is some discussion about, I think, expanding additional hospital beds at the state level to try to keep that flow going. The reality is that we are in a place where if we're going to do it, it's going to be some of our effort, some creative effort with places like Housing Unlimited that helps us to find permanent housing, permanent independent housing for folks with major mental illnesses who are at a certain stage in their recovery. So we are continuing to work with them.
Thank you. Then my final question for now, before we go through the budget process, is what sort of resources are given to the families who go through the mental health court system? What support structure is in place for them to figure out where to make the appropriate referral? And because I know there's a clinical capacity issue too. I mean, we don't have enough clinical support out there to meet the demand beyond just the housing and the beds. And so if I could hear a little bit more about what we're doing as part of this very impressive system to support families, that would be great.
Sure, I'll start with this, and I may call on one of my staff members to help us if I get in too much trouble. But one of the things that happens, our team, our clinical social workers, therapists, who from the moment they start an assessment with a team, they start looking at the forensic history, the criminogenic factors, the level of risk, but they also look at things like their housing stability, their needs for ongoing therapy, their medication needs, et cetera, and who is out there in the community that can form a partnership with them that can provide that service. And they start linking up with providers in the community. We have a forensic assertive community treatment team, a FACT team. We have providers in the community that that know something about criminogenic thinking in this population and can work with them to help. We work with them to help them be able to manage and treat folks. There are places where we can get them medication if they need it, both short-term and the long-term. In the long term, getting them linked up. If they have financial needs, we link them back to our department. One of the nice things about being HHS is that we can knock on a door and get somebody connected into some parts of our system. So that's a piece of what we do with them. The housing pieces, we're always wrestling around housing and trying to find affordable housing, and sometimes it may be Oxford, or sometimes it's the shelter for a moment or two, and until we can get them into a residential rehab. But the team that we field is the team that is trained and has considerable experience in dealing with this population and their particular set of needs, especially around the criminogenic pieces. They're also training other providers in the community as we go forward and bringing them up to speed and giving them some more tools and skills to deal with a population that might otherwise cycle back to jail. So that's just some of what the team is involved in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Rice, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to follow up on something that Councilmember Hucker was talking about, and that's our schools and our juveniles who really would stand to benefit from some sort of expansion. You know, I just received a couple weeks ago a transmission from a number of parents who were concerned about the fact that throughout the year a child had been acting out in their middle school classroom and had disrupted class approximately, they had said, about 25 times. And again, when the school brought in the parents to ask them to, agree to some sort of treatment plan, whatever the case may be, the parents declined and said they weren't interested in that. And so we face ourselves in a very difficult conundrum, one in which you have students in a classroom that are being denied an opportunity to move forward because there continue to be disruptions in the classroom, but at the same time you have an individual, a young child, who with the proper support can also be connected and also get the education that they need in order to be successful and continue on in life. And so I really think that it's something that we have to pay very close attention to. I've seen it in my own daughter's classroom, to where a classroom had to be cleared a number of times for a young woman who is now getting the services, or a young girl, getting the services that she needs, and is prospering and thriving and doing so much better as a result. This is what's at stake, and it really is one in which all of you here on the dais know that if that person's not given the services, they end up being most likely a part of our homeless population at some point, still seeking to get those services that they never were able to get. And it really is one in which I think that, again, we've got to be intentional about how we make a stand in saying, and I understand that we have to be very careful about forced treatment, about forcing things on parents who don't want, or don't think that that's a necessity. But at the same time, just much as we do with vaccines and vaccinations, which is a huge topic right now, right? We say that a child can't go back to school unless they've been vaccinated. So it's interesting that we do it from the physical side, but we don't do it from the mental side. And I think that that's something that we have to pay very close attention to. Dr. Kroll, I know you and I have had this conversation many times before. Can you speak on what you think is best for us to do in terms of how we need to move forward with this? And I encourage you, I understand that you have limitations, but I want, in you telling me, you telling us here on the dais, if you had a wand, what you would create as a structure for how we deal with this issue.
Councilmember Rice, I really don't have all the time to think about what I would wave my wand to do. It'd be a long wave. I think that you are right about the numbers. I can tell you, just yesterday I looked at the numbers of children that we see coming over from mental health, from the school system to the crisis center, and we're on track to exceed. Last year we saw 1,800 children. This year we're on track to exceed that. I think we're at 1,500 right now, and we haven't gotten to June yet. So I think we will surpass that number. I think that what it says to us, when we see folks, most of them are coming over for some form of emotional dysregulation. They're either suicidal or have some suicidal ideation, or have gotten angry and had an explosive outburst, or are cutting themselves or threatening to cut themselves. So a lot of it is stabilization and trying to get them to the help that they need, and back into the system, back to school, and keeping them on task. I think our conversations with the schools have been productive around trying to think about how do we introduce more pro-social, more healthy development, more wellness-based curricula and processes in the schools. We've done suicide prevention and early intervention work with schools. I think the real thing is that, for me, it would be, if I were waving this wand, it would be a system where we had not just what you think of as school-based mental health, because most people, when they say mental health, they think diagnosis and treatment. And that's not what I'm thinking of. There's a piece of that, and there's a place for a piece of that, but there needs to be a model that is about promoting mental health and wellness that helps our young children learn to regulate themselves and emotionally, and learn when it's time for help. It's a model where if I see someone suffering and struggling, I'm not afraid to say, hey, look, let's get you some help. Let's get you connected to somebody. And it's a system where the teachers, the principals, the janitors know what to do when they see somebody who's struggling, and know how to intervene. Because sometimes it's just a matter of saying, hey, are you okay? And let's take you someplace and get you somebody to talk to. I think that is the model that I would think of, so that more of our work is spent on the front end of this, trying to promote and keep them focused and on task and attending school and without conduct problems. But there are children, like you described, when things have gone too far, that you need an intervention that gets them, stabilizes the classroom, stabilizes the person, and gets them back into the room. You know, the issue of voluntary and involuntary, that is something that that I don't know that anyone can touch in a meaningful way. Parents, you're right, we have mandated public health in schools. It is a mandate that there's a public health nurse or public health official aide in every school. We've not done that for behavioral health, and it may be time to think about how do we do that.
Yeah, Mr. McCarthy, please.
Yeah, I don't think we're talking about the same case, but maybe we are. Unfortunately, I think the scenario, Mr. Rice, that you set out is one that we see in criminal justice all the time. And one of the complexities is, and again, I'm not here apologizing for the school system, but I've seen a couple of cases recently where I think the schools acted appropriately. One of the difficulties in some of the cases I see that come to us criminally are that there is a parent that's resistant to, for whatever reason, we're recommending your child has ADHD, they need to take medication. I'm not going to medicate my child. It's not the measles vaccine, but I think that there are repercussions for taking it. I don't want my child on. I don't want him to be addicted. That's my personal philosophy. My child's not going to take that. So no medication. We make a referral, or the school makes the referral. In a case where I know there were 75 letters written home to the parent. Well, they didn't want the referral. There's an alternative school where maybe there could be other services provided. I'm not going to take, again, one of the complexity, and it is absolutely an issue, but the complexity also is, not only can we provide the services or the school make the appropriate recommendation, you've got to have a parent in the home that's willing to accept the recommendations and cooperate. I'm not saying that, and there are probably people begging for these resources, but unfortunately, I will tell you, I've also seen the other side of the coin where, for whatever reason, people are exercising parental rights and not following the recommendations made by the schools. And we that's a further complexity that is beyond the power of, I think, everybody in this room to control.
Well, I think that as we look at, and I certainly want to hear from the judges as well, because, look, if we set contingencies for these kind of situations to where, look, if you want your child to remain in their home school, these are the things that we're going to need to do, or else we're going to have to send them to an alternative school. And it's very similar to if a child comes in and has a gun. We, at that point, as a system, have the right to say that child no longer is going to attend that school and has to go to another school. It's just very interesting that we do all of these things for everything else, even though in these instances, and this is where I'm very concerned about, again, us capitulating, understanding that what really benefits the child or what benefits the individual in these cases of us providing support is that they're the ones who lose. They're the ones that suffer, right? And so why we would allow that to happen when, again, a child who just goes up without a mental illness and gets in a fight and strikes somebody and seriously injures someone, that child may be expelled from that school. But if that same child has a mental illness and has an outburst to where they bite the teacher, the same sort of treatment it's not the same, right? We don't treat those same instances the same. And I think from that perspective, we need to create some guidelines that, because if we're stigmatizing it by saying, oh, well, in that case, it's something different, when in reality, it's more of a necessity for treatment. If it's one case where you just need to tell Johnny he needs to keep his hands off of Billy, but in another case, it's where the constant outbursts and the assault on teachers and students continue over and over again, and you're nodding your head because we probably are talking about the same case. But that being said, those are the kinds of things that, again, rise to the level of we need to be intervening, not only for the sake of the teacher and the staff and the students that are in that classroom, but also for that individual. And we do it for adults. So why don't we do it for kids, right? And so that's where I am. And I know you guys aren't arguing and saying, I know both of you aren't saying don't do it, but I just think that is something where we really have to take the next step. And I know you guys both agree. Judge, please.
I don't think that anyone disagrees with that, at least not anyone in this room. And I think there are some observations that I would make, and let me step out of my judge wheelhouse into my law school professor wheelhouse and tell you that there is federal jurisprudence on vaccines and the public health need for vaccines and the reason that schools can keep children out if they choose to for not having vaccines because of the greater good. There is not any jurisprudence in terms of behavioral health on that piece of it. So that's one complication, not something that, it's not a barrier, it's just an obstacle. many of the policies that would be applied to school children, to minors, would come under school regulations, obviously, behavioral regulations, and then you've got a host of federal statutes that offer protections for students other than what we have in the court system. And even greater than that, and if this is redundant, excuse me, there is and remains a stigma to anything called mental health or behavioral problem. And not so for people that are here, because we understand. But there are people that work with Judge Sabet and I who don't think that we should be calling this session mental health court, because that has a negative stigma. And that's, that's something that people in families share as well. And so I think that in addition to the efforts and the services that we would like to have children, and I speak as a member of the community, I would love to see behavioral health support services for children. I mean, heaven knows what traumas they see at home that play out in school. But getting to those, I think, is a little more complicated than the structure that we have in our mental health court, because those people are mandatorily under our control and jurisdiction, under our thumb. And so, we're kind of in some cases making them offers that are very appealing to them, whereas children aren't going to make the choices themselves. And if we don't have family buy-in without some pejorative bias-looking kind of, your kid's crazy, your kid's the bad kid, then I think it will present just a problem from a community, I say as a former PTA president.
I was going to say as well is that, and again, this is not in the realm of the district court, but IDEA, free and appropriate education, FAPE, that's what every child is entitled to. And it's complicated in a matter of special education law, which is something dealt with as an administrative law judge, actually, that makes it very difficult. And it goes down to the IEP and how it's structured and who can weigh in on that. And again, kind of going along with what Judge Mitchell has said and what all the other speakers have said here today, it comes down to a matter of educating the public, perhaps starting in the schools, in trying not to stigmatize these issues and making them more open so that we don't have the type of tragedies that we've had in schools, and to reach out to these children and assist them. Although it is complicated, I'm sure, as Dr. Crow would say, is that in the young years, it's sometimes difficult to differentiate between different diagnoses in children, which makes it even more difficult. But it definitely needs to be destigmatized.
Years ago, generations ago, when I was at Garrett Park Elementary School, a really long time ago, there used to be the President's Physical Fitness Award.
Yep.
And that was obviously focused on physical fitness. I never got it. Everyone else in my family did.
Your Honor, I can write to him for you and see if we can get it.
I just tell my siblings, look, I could put you in jail.
Okay, all right.
But, focusing on introducing the concept of physical mind-body health at a very young age, with some sort of a buy-in for children and families, that there's an award. Not that everybody gets a trophy, but that there's a goal. And, yes, physical health and mental health and behavioral health, and this is how we live together in a community.
So just one comment about that is to underscore that I think that this idea of mental illness or mental health is very much stigmatized. But what's much less so is this concept of wellness and well-being and healthy development. And it's how we reframe this conversation. And I think there's some effort beginning around the country when you see positive psychology and health. And if everybody's listening to mindfulness, a different discussion, but there is an effort to try to talk about the integration of mind and body, and taking care of one takes care of the other one. We have a county-run program that is it healthy, live healthy? It's the Live well. That when I look at that and look at the things that they encourage people to do, have direct connection to to mental health and stress reduction. So.
Good. Well, this has probably been the most interesting budget hearing we've ever had, our budget discussion. And I know that we've gone through much of what's in this packet. The one Linda or Susan are going to have to correct me on this, but I know the one thing that we did talk about or was being mentioned is whether or not there's any interest in expanding the court, and if we are, then it would be recommended to look at it for the second half of FY20. Go ahead.
So I would just say, after listening to this discussion, which has just been fascinating, I think approving what the executive has in the budget, which is for the 7 positions.
Right.
And the funding for the court, sounds like it serves what we have now.
Yep.
But it sounds like you will want to revisit these issues of what would we need if we had a competency court? And then it also sounds like you would like to reconvene at some point with the circuit court and the Department of Juvenile Services and the schools to talk about, whether there is a structure to amend the process, and the state's attorney, to amend the process in the juvenile system, whereby maybe there's a different way to get more young people a different set of services than they're getting through the current juvenile services system. Does that seem to be
Absolutely. I
what
think that's exactly
is
where
the
we are.
discussion?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for all that you do, and thank you for being with us. I have to tell you, John, your budget hearing is going to be much tougher. I just want you to know that up front. Yeah. All right, the next item that we're going to go through, we have 2 other items here. Thank you all. And hopefully, we'll see you this afternoon at graduation. Thank you. The next, we're going to go back to number 1 now, and that's the adult drug court. And we have Ms. Buckland from HHS, Dr. Crowell from HHS as well. Gina Davis, is she going to?
So actually, she called, drug court is in
In
session
session.
this morning, so.
She has a valid excuse, very valid excuse. And someone from OMB, if they're here. Would you like to take us through the background, please?
So the circuit court representative's not here because they're actually in drug court. Now, for the new members, you weren't in on all the discussions, but the joint committee and the council had a lot of discussion with drug court in the last budget with Judge Roop. And you heard very clearly about the changing characteristics of the participants in drug court over the years. And so in the fall, we added another position. That position still remains fully funded. The position is in process of hiring, so it should be there very soon. And I think there's information in your packet just about the fact sheet on the drug court and the positions and the budget. There's some questions on page 4 about what the capacity is. And then also, some of the discussion we had last year was some people were being diverted to other service providers because we had some shortages in staffing, but also for other reasons. So I think approval of the budget is fine. And I didn't know if you just wanted to hear from Dr. Kroll a little bit about the questions on the last page and, how it's working now with getting staffing up to complement.
I think that's, very, exactly what I was thinking as well, and I know that we should hear from Dr. Crowell, but one of the questions that we do have, of course, is the staffing shortages and how fast we could hire if we did hire, how fast that would actually take place. So if you could please touch on that.
Thank you. The drug court is in many respects like the mental health court in terms of partnership and collaboration that makes it work effectively.
And do a wonderful job as well.
The team does, and I'm sorry that Jenna isn't here because she's a treat to work with and to know. I think the staffing issues last year, we were struggling because we had vacant positions, and at some point the council voted to add an additional position and support for those positions. We are at this point 1 position down, and I think it is the new one. Well, actually, we hired the new one, then someone then left. My memory serves me that we have signed the selection memo. I know they were in recruitment when the package was being developed, so we signed a selection memo. At this point, it's a matter of how quickly Office of Human Resources can process and onboard the recruit, and that depends on a number of things. How many folks are ahead of them in that line, how quickly they can get through background checks and medical clearances and give them an offer and a start date. So I don't have a good guess about the length of time to get this last position filled. So Vicki, if you want to.
I just, jump in. Okay, so on our side, we have made some fundamental changes in how we approach recruitment for a number of different position types, and therapist is one of them, where obviously we have therapists that work in a lot of different programs. And so we've actually moved to doing a single large recruitment for therapists in general. Raymond and his folks have done a lot of work on how to coordinate on working off of those lists together, interviewing and then parsing folks out to where they likely fit best. So we've done a lot of work on our side to try to streamline and make the best use out of, let's get a big recruitment out, let's get a bunch of different names, let's figure out where they fit. Obviously, that doesn't get you out of going through the entire HR process, including background checks and medical and, everything else. But it has made a big difference in staffing of these positions. So, we've made a very big effort when we have an active list. If there's a recruitment that comes along, if we've got an active list, go to that, right away. And because we've moved to that, we don't have to do now a separate recruitment. Just go to that active list. So we've done a number of things internally to try to streamline that process to try to keep these positions filled.
That's very good. In fact, I think when we tried to get the additional therapists, that was one of the concerns, is how long it was actually going to take. Once you find somebody qualified and go through all of that, how fast can we get someone on board? So anyhow, is there any, I'm fine with, is there any, go ahead.
Thank you. So I just have a quick question or two. So the success of the program clearly is tied to those who are able to sustain crime-free, drug-free, sober life. And the information that I am missing is what that success rate is, as I suppose measured by you, or have I overlooked that somewhere? There are 82 individuals who 82 participants currently. Where are these individuals now, or individuals who've prior gone through the program?
So active individuals the 82 it refers to folks who are in active treatment now. And I think the length of stay in treatment, I wish John McCarthy was still here on this, the length of individuals, the length of time they may stay in the program can range from a minimum of just a few months to excellent, to several years, depending on how well they progress through the stages of the program. Once they graduate, there is some effort to track them, I think, in the community, and I don't know what those numbers look like in the moment, but I think we're running somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80% of folks who graduate who don't end up back in the court system and don't have a rearrest.
Did you please identify yourself? And
Yes, sorry. My name's Karen Mooney. I'm with the State's Attorney's Office, and I handle drug court for our office. We do track recidivism afterwards, and Ms. Davis actually handles, and we look people up through case search and just get word of arrests. I don't know the percentages off the top of my head, but it's a significantly lower recidivism rate. Drug court is a little bit different than mental health court in terms of the types of offenders that come in. It is for people with much lengthier criminal histories that have failed at treatment many times before, so they would have generally a much higher recidivism rate. I think our recidivism rate is about 25%, but that's significantly lower than if you look at the national averages for a recidivism rate for somebody who has a criminal history of that length.
Absolutely. That's the information I was looking for. Thank you. And I by no means, I'm trying to compare it to the conversation we just had prior.
Oh, no.
So, right, exactly.
There's just different criteria for who comes into each program.
Sure. And then, as has been alluded to in the packet, I just want to hear your thoughts regarding the opioid epidemic and the increased need for treatment and lengthier time of treatment. So how has that affected this and relevant to this conversation, affected the budget as that epidemic has spread?
Yeah, well, if you want to go first, I'll follow up.
I can tell you from our office's standpoint, when we have people who are coming in, drug court has just started what we're calling the intervention track. And that is for low-level offenders who have less than 7 prior criminal offenses on their record and who have less than 18 months of backup time available to them. We are not utilizing the pre-release center for that, so they are going to outside treatment. But it's kind of geared towards the opiate addict who, as I'm sure you know, we have the IPSA program for a first-time drug offender, but IPSA just isn't enough for an opiate addict. And so this intervention track is getting them into treatment 3 times a week. They still have to go to 3 AA or NA meetings a week. They have to do urinalysis 3 times a week, and they still report to court weekly. But they are not going through the pre-release center. So that's kind of geared towards the opiate addicts because there is a significant increase. And especially even on district court cases where someone's charged with simple possession. Well, they don't have a lot of backup time, so the general structure of drug court with using the pre-release center wouldn't work. This track is allowing us to get them into more intense treatment so that they can get that treatment that they need to hopefully overcome the addiction. And we are seeing a lot of on overdose cases that it's addicts sharing. And so I've been working with Mr. McCarthy because I handle a lot of our overdose prosecutions for the dealers. Some of them aren't necessarily drug dealers. They're not making money off of this. They're sharing drugs. And so we're working on trying to address both the incarceration aspect as well as getting them treatment.
And the previous conversation, I was asking about housing as well, and how is that component helping or being a detriment to some of these individuals?
The housing piece is exactly the same situation,
Yeah.
Except that in some cases it's a little worse because they now have a conviction, and that limits their access to some federally funded housing subsidies. So that complicates it a little bit. But we're always trying to balance the housing needs, compare the housing needs and match the housing needs to their addiction pattern and their history. So Oxford housing or supported housing is an important part of that process for us as well. They don't use residential rehabilitation. That's primarily a mental health housing process, but we have a lot of small aggregate living homes and Oxford houses that are formally designated as Oxford houses. So, to your other question about the opiates, we certainly have seen an increase in the number of folks through drug court and through all our systems who are in recovery from opiate abuse and are subject to relapse. We've had to change over the last several years our testing protocols to make sure that we had the most updated testing available to be able to track not only opiates but fentanyl and prescription drugs in the system. We have had to increase our contact and our connection with them on a more regular basis. And I think the use of medicated assisted treatments is rising both in the drug court population and in the population in general, because that's one of the most effective means of combating a relapse and preventing a relapse.
As that issue doesn't show any signs of going away nationally and clearly locally, thank you for that work. And a lot of individuals in the community are not aware of how systemic that really is. And so we need to keep combating it every which way we can, and just thank you for that good work.
I think in Maryland still, isn't it about 6 deaths a day, a little over 5 deaths a day in Maryland for an opioid? And that's coming down, or is because of Narcan and other products. We're keeping people alive, but it's still not changing the concern.
So actually, I think nationally the numbers are up. 70,000 people in 2017. We don't know the numbers for 2018 yet. The deaths through the third quarter of 2018 for the state were up. If there is anything that sounds like good news in that, it is that Montgomery County was one of 10 counties in the state for which the overdose deaths went down through 3 quarters. And I think through the end of the year, we're going to see a drop in overdose deaths in the county. I'm guardedly optimistic and waiting on the data for that, but I think so. And I think Narcan, public education, we have a group in the county, and I know that Linda and I had talked about at some point coming back to you all and giving you a full briefing on the work of the overdose intervention team, the work that we are collectively doing in the county to try to drive these numbers down. So happy to do that.
I can tell you, drug court, and I go to the graduations for that as well, and I tell the story, and I'm going to do it very quickly, that this one young man said that he had been in and out of jail for since he was 15, didn't bother him, yada, yada. And then he went before Judge Quirk when he was sitting on the bench, and Judge Quirk said, I'm not going to give you concurrent time, I'm going to give you consecutive time, and he was going to end up, I believe, in jail for 110 years. And he turned to Judge Quirk, who was standing next to him that day, and he said, Your Honor, you got my attention that day. And he came to drug court, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. He was reunited with his family, and he hopefully is doing well. So you really do a marvelous job. Any other questions, or are we okay to approve it the way that Linda said? Thank you very much for all that you do. And we have one left. What'd you say? May 1st. Thank you. I'll try to put that on my calendar. And the last one that we have today is the Monitor Exchange and Supervised Visitation Center. And I guess everybody gets to stay at the table, so thank you very much. And who's going to lead us through that one? Linda, are you going to start, or?
So this started as a part of the FY18 budget, and it was the effort to establish a place where there could be both safe exchanges but also supervised visitation. And so it is up and running. We have some experience now. And Dr. Kroll can, of course, talk to you about how it's operating. I think that the issue that is before you budgetarily, the executive has continued the funding. The FY19 funding is continued in FY20. I actually did just note for you, you're going to end up, especially in HHS, we'll end up talking about this. But of course, this has been the practice, which is the nonprofit contracts get flat funded from year to year, and you've already heard testimony like from nonprofit Montgomery. So this would be one of the nonprofit contracts that if there was an inflationary adjustment would be eligible for it. But the issue that actually is before you, which you can see from the increase in use now that it's really up and running in terms of the number of people who are using the center and also the courts using the center, is the need to expand the hours, or the proposal to expand the hours. And Court Watch did give you testimony about that, as well as an earlier email. And I actually asked HHS that if there were to be an expansion of the hours, what their recommendation would be around that. And there's a table on how they believe an additional 10 hours could be used. And we also talked about the estimate that Court Watch had provided. That would only be for the family services, and so we would need to double check on the security costs and also the costs with general services to actually do some facility work to make another room for supervised visitation. And so in the packet, what I said is a placeholder, put $175,000 on the rec list, and we'll sort out what the actual number is if the committee wishes to go along with that recommendation. And then I would just say that Dr. Kroll and I've also talked about how we would start to really get enough use and enough data to be able to talk better about whether another actual facility is needed and where it would be. And I think we're not really there yet to say that we're ready to decide on that, but we're talking about, like, how do we look at the data? Where are parents coming from? You know, what are the hours that they're using, those kinds of things. But I wouldn't put anything in yet in terms of a budget for a recommendation on that. I think we need to come back and revisit that particular.
Well, I'm where you are. I believe the 175,000, I mean, these facilities are so it was unbelievable when we began the conversation that you had to have two separate parking lots from where each parent was coming in. You had to have two separate doors. You had to have, yeah, I mean, all of these security issues, everything that was associated with it. And you know, we're talking about people who are court-ordered that want to see their children. I mean, you know, and of course, there's abuse involved from spousal abuse and every other type. So I'm in agreement with that. I know that we have a light flashing. I can't tell whose light is flashing here. Please, go ahead.
So I actually have a family member who's used the center, who used to do an exchange at Montgomery Mall. And this creates a tremendous difference. The expanded hours are incredibly important, especially because it's the only one in the county.
Yep.
And so expanding the hours actually gives more flexibility to be able to negotiate when those times may be. And so in lieu of having another facility that may be closer to folks, extending the hours is certainly, I believe, the right thing to do and would support the $175,000.
Councilmember Hucker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and Mary and Laurie and the other advocates for getting this off the ground and so far along. I'm really pleased about the progress and the number of clients you're serving. I saw the number of visitations and monitor exchanges. Are there numbers on how many families are affected?
I'm not aware of the numbers of families, but I think
Please, come on.
we probably can
Okay.
get you that.
And then,
We have a lifeline coming. We have somebody with the answer coming from the back.
There's also the cases from the courts, and
Yeah, with the
you don't
numbers.
have to be you don't have to be directed there from the court to use the center, so
Right.
it can be more than that.
Please identify yourself and.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Karen Mall. I'm the Program Director of the Safe Passage Center. For this particular fiscal year, we have served 354 children and parents.
terrific, okay. Again, thank you, Karen, for your help on this. This is, it's just such a great community service, and I've been interested in a down county or east county where we have such a transportation deficit location since the beginning of this. And since I appreciate what you said about the budget restrictions, but since commercial real estate becomes available so infrequently on long time horizons, and since there's such specialty requirements with a facility like this with separate entrances and separate parking lots and all that, could we begin to look for another location for down the road? Because when we decide, say next year, that funding's available, it still might be another year or two before we identify a location. Is that right?
I can't speak to how long a particular final location. I do understand your concern about the availability of space, but certainly beginning to scout and look around and think about that, should one be needed, is something we can certainly do.
Terrific.
Okay.
And the program has been evolved, and we have been expanding our databases and collecting data. And I do have some preliminary data of where our parents are coming from, if that's information
Please, yes.
you'd like to have. And if you actually look at the preliminary data, it looks like, at the present time, the majority of our parents are actually coming from Silver Spring and from the Damascus, Gaithersburg, and Germantown areas.
Spring and Damascus, okay. You don't hear that often.
Well, we'll share.
Good?
I think they are.
Yes, one is for monitored exchange parents, and the other is for supervised visitation.
Okay, well,
Thank you, this is really helpful. I know, Karen, there's also been concerns about security at the center, and do you have any thoughts on enhanced lighting or other things that I've heard there might be a need for? especially in the winter months?
We work very closely with the county monitors, and they've been very supportive, and we appreciate their guidance through as we've evolved. And we've certainly discussed that the outside may need some additional lighting, and maybe some additional, we already have a camera system installed, so it's really perhaps just expanding them so we can have additional areas that are now on camera.
Okay. Does HHS have any thoughts on this, Doctor?
None at this point, but I think it's a question of what we can, how to look at it as we think about the expansion of the space and facility.
Have there been security incidents since the center opened?
Actually, I think just because security is very preventative in nature, and I know from a staff standpoint, we work very hard on building relationships. I mean, because we understand that the metal detectors are there, but relationships that we have with these parents, both parents, is really our number one security measure. So, I mean, we've provided 2,491 visits and exchanges since we've opened, and we've needed to seek assistance from law enforcement to manage behavior on 2 occasions.
Oh, great. And then finally, do you track demographic information about income eligibility to know whether your clients are eligible for transportation assistance in particular or other services?
Part of our intake process is we do some questions on whether or not they do need whether they're coming from public transportation, they're driving, Uber. So we do have that information that's distributed on our monthly reports. And for the families that are on public transportation, Court Watch actually did a transportation study, which was very helpful. And I know that the goal of the transportation subsidy that is currently in the budget is to assist families that are coming from farther locations like the Germantown. You know, how can we decrease the amount of time it takes them to get to the program? So the emphasis has really been on decreasing the amount of time for families to travel. It has really not been income-based, so we're not gathering any income information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen? Yeah. Well, I think we have agreement that the 175,000 should be placed on the placeholder list, I guess, is what we're saying, and then we'll come back and figure out. But I do think it's a good idea that if anybody knows of another spot where this would be something that should be considered, that we at least become aware of it and know what we can do with it. And there again, thank you all for all that you're doing. Anything else? Are we adjourned on this? Thank you very much.